Hello and welcome to Media Lit, where we treat each piece of media like great literature. I am your host, Randy Elaine, and joining me, as always, is the wonderful, the empathetic, and the recently shaved Kris Ingersoll. Kris, how you doing tonight, man?
You know, Randy, I would never lie to you, nor to the podlings at home. And it's been a little bit of a tough couple of days, but I still find myself able to authentically answer that question. That I am so good, Randy. I'm so good, Randy, because I get to pod with you tonight, but more importantly, and more to the heart of the matter, we have a topic that has been a long time cooking, that you've been really passionate about bringing to life. And we have a guest who I am incredibly honored to be able to have this conversation with, a gentleman I'm happy to have any conversation with. I'm thrilled tonight to welcome one of my former colleagues, a motivational speaker, an educator, a marathon runner, a giant in any community he is a part of, a gentleman who I am grateful to call brother and friend, a true man of God. Chuck Jones joins us tonight. Chuck, welcome to the podcast.
Well, man, Kris, thank you so much for your incredible words. Randy, thank you so much for your incredible welcome. I think it's both an honor and a privilege to be able to share intellectual thought, but then also at the same time be able to conversate about a piece of literature, as you framed, Randy, that has honestly shaped the ways in which we all seek to solve problems across lines of adversity. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that, as Randy had mentioned, Kris is well shaved and, and shining incredible inside of this room. But I'm just grateful to be here, and I look forward to really unpacking a pivotal piece of American history to hopefully enlighten and illuminate the great work of Dr. King.
And Chuck, we're trying to get better about inviting our guests to plug their social media or any work they have going on in the world, any work they're associated with that they feel they want to use this opportunity to highlight. So take it away if there's anything you want to shout out.
I got two things that I would share with anybody that I think's worth reading. Over the last couple of years, I've had the opportunity to work on a design thread on psychological safety and social belonging that is just like, it's so invigorating to think about how the things that we embodied when we were in Boston and the things that I've learned while being here in Brooklyn and in New York really resonate with what I grew up on growing up in the South in Carolina. So if you can, check out design, equitybydesign.org. Shout out to Dr. Eric Tucker that led the charrette. And then the second thing is that if you want to find me, as Kris mentioned, I am a two-time world champ, proud two-time New York City marathon runner.
My man.
My social media, or Instagram as the kids will call it these days, is Chuck Jones with no K. So just CHUCJONES.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chuck. And I love how you framed how important it is for us to have a conversation about Dr. Martin Luther King. Folks who checked out the episode title will know we are here to talk about Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham Jail, which is maybe the most pivotal document from the height of the civil rights movement and the fight to end segregation. And it came at one of those moments in time where everything is coming to a head. So many of like the biggest headlines and speeches and moments that we think about when we think of the civil rights movement happens like in and around the months surrounding this letter. So certainly we're talking about decades and even hundreds of years of work that people have been doing, but this is one particular moment that's really valuable. Now, this is the point in the podcast where I usually do a synopsis of the thing we are about to explore. But what I'm going to try to do is contextualize this document before we dig in a little bit deeper. So the first context I want to get to just has to do with the framing of this podcast in and of itself, because there's a little bit of an elephant in the room. This is a pivotal document from the civil rights movement that I've spent a pretty good amount of time studying and learning about. that I find particularly enlightening and moving. But I think acknowledging the place where I'm coming at this from is really important. I am a white male who lives in a predominantly white community and teaches at a predominantly white high school. I teach in the community where I grew up. And while I've lived around in different places a little bit, I would say my world experience, my exposure to different cultures globally and even around the United States in a lot of ways is limited. So when I say that I think this document is valuable and I think everyone can benefit from it, I'm not saying that from up on a high horse. I'm not saying that from up on a pedestal, suggesting that I have some kind of special knowledge or understanding. It's that I really want to share a conversation and lean into learning about something that people like me would benefit from asking questions about and wanting to learn more about and wanting to understand on a deeper level. And as we get into what Dr. King has to say about advocacy, allyship, I think there are moments in my own life where I can say I've been very successful. But again, I'm not up on a high horse because you do not have to dig very deep into my history to find examples of ways I could have been a better ally or fights that I could be fighting more actively. This is about a certain presence of mind as far as I'm concerned. So that's the spirit I approach this context with. And I'm excited to hear from Kris and Chuck on that. But if you're a listener out there, and we're covering the context or the content of this letter, and you feel like you have some insight, I'm not a historian, I'm not an expert, and there are so many people out there with the life experience that would bring this to life. We would so happily welcome any feedback you want to give us. And if we get enough of that feedback, we'd be happy to share it on a future podcast. So before I get into my quick little timeline and synopsis, Kris or Chuck, did you have any contextualizing you wanted to add from like your personal perspectives? That was kind of my Randy-centric version.
No, I mean, I think I would find myself echoing much of what you just shared, right? We come from a similar place with similar backgrounds. All I can say is that tonight I hope to offer my authentic response to these words as I experience them upon this reading in this present moment of my life. And that's all it is a response. And I want to reiterate your invitation to open dialogue. This feels like an excellent opportunity to hear from the folks who listen to this conversation and want to contribute.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I would be pretty explicit in saying I am a proud, African American black male. I can't run away from it if I wanted to, right? Like I'm born on June 19th. And so also at the same time, I think it's really important to say and name that as a HBCU graduate, as the largest and the greatest HBCU, shameless plug, North Carolina A&T.
Always.
But also as a member of the first Divine Nine fraternity. Dr. King is a fraternal brother of mine and someone I've both looked up to long before I became a fraternal brother of his, is that I firmly believe that togetherness helps introduce new knowledge. But also at the same time, I firmly believe that there is so much to the Black diaspora that I would never consider myself all encompassing of the culture, and I am constantly learning so much about what does it mean to be both present in both past as well as in future tense in my actions. And then lastly, like as an educator, I think the thing that I loved about both Martin Luther King's work as well as his work as in, mobilization, but like work as well as in his oratorical speeches and written composition is that it was all synonymous of his life's work. So you're not going to see someone pop in and out of a side like Martin Luther King never appropriated. And in this conversation tonight, we get a chance to uplift and highlight really several calls to action that still show to be both relevant today. And whether that's with any listener of this community be on one side of the line or another side of the line politically. I think as humans, we are able to understand a level of appreciation for what this work and the quotes that we'll unpack and digest truly mean for us all. So I just want to just say that with the open heart, even as we get ready to unpack these words, there's still people both present in our lives that have learned from these words and had to live these words and be held accountable to these words in ways in which a conversation at this moment and this magnitude doesn't even really give justice to. So, Randy and Kris, I appreciate you for making this both a safe space, but also at the same time, we're going to keep it real and be very honest that we are all learners inside of this space.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, man. Like, I am already feeling that sort of sense of togetherness. I already trust you and Kris so much in this conversation. So thank you so much for that framing. All right. So in terms of the letter itself, I put together my little timeline. This came from stuff that was in my own memory banks. This came from some research that I did. Although I would say like my favorite resource I used to construct this little timeline was from Marie A. Sutton's book about the A.J. Gaston Motel in Birmingham as a landmark. Had a really thoughtful, in-depth timeline of some of the stuff that maybe doesn't make it into like the larger picture of this letter. So we could start the story anywhere. I'm going to start in September of 1962. A.J. Gaston, local entrepreneur, local activist, owner of the Gaston Hotel, which is really like the center of this whole Birmingham, Alabama movement. He's offering certain leaders of this movement free and reduced lodging during this protest process. However, he is not necessarily fully aligned with all the methods that everyone's looking to use. There's some complications to how everyone believes we should best approach things. So in September 1962, we've got some student protests firing up, really trying to start to do some sit-ins, et cetera, trying to get local businesses to desegregate. Gaston and some other folks step in and they try to engage in some negotiations. And they're able to get some promises from some local business leaders to remove signage from businesses. But some of these signs quickly go back up. Some of them never come down whatsoever. The local affiliate of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference reaches out to Martin Luther King and his whole network looking for support, saying, I think we're going to need some wider direct action to take place. So moving on from there, the pieces start to fall into place. There's a lot of planning that goes into exactly when this protest should happen. In 1962, Birmingham actually votes to kind of restructure the government quite a bit. And you've got some folks like Public Safety Commissioner Eugene Connor, technically should no longer be in his position because they've restructured the government. And he refuses to vacate his office. So he is still giving instructions to like the police force, the firefighting force, etc. So that's one layer of tension that we have here. As we approach these protests that are set up to happen during the Easter season to put the most possible economic pressure on local business leaders, Dr. King and all of the other activists are starting to rally support, but there is this tension. And on April 9th of 1963, A.J. Gaston writes this statement for the local papers where he does kind of let a little bit of frustration with like these outside activists coming in. He kind of hints that people should be listening more to like the local leadership as opposed to these outside people. One of the people he was referring to is certainly himself. So he's in this difficult position of both supporting and pushing back on the methods that we have. This leads to a little bit of infighting. There are some folks who accuse Gaston of being an Uncle Tom, and everyone kind of walks that back. Everyone sits down. They have some meetings. We kind of settle on that. On April 10th, as this series of actions that are designed to take place over many days and weeks approaches, Eugene Connor, who has, again, refused to vacate his position, calls for an injunction that suddenly makes it illegal for protesters to march. He also quadruples the bail just ahead of all of these demonstrations to try to stop them from happening. From his perspective, he would say he's doing this in the name of public safety, but it's pretty clear that this is meant to suppress the action. On April 12th, we get the clergy letter that eventually sparks the letter from Birmingham Jail. 8 moderate religious leaders from the South who have already kind of called out these direct action methods back in January. They double down on that. They say these protests are untimely. They're a bad idea. They refer to Martin Luther King and other people from his organization as outside agitators. And this is the same day where Martin Luther King has to make a decision. Are we going to march or not? Are we going to kick this off? Are we going to break these laws? Are we going to bring it there? Are things going to get ugly? There are people even within Martin Luther King's own circle who have reached the point where they're saying maybe today is not the day. He ultimately has to follow his heart. He ultimately goes out, he marches, the other leaders join him, and things start happening very quickly from there. MLK is very quickly arrested for breaking the law on April 12th. He goes to prison, spends some time in solitary confinement. His first phone call with his wife is courtesy of like personal phone calls from John F. Kennedy, trying to calm the situation down. He eventually gets into some more comfortable locations. He gets access to some paper. He starts writing the longhand form of letter from Birmingham Jail. And then we have this moment where everything in the civil rights movement is really writing itself straight into the history books. A few weeks later, we have like the Children's Crusade March, where children are encouraged to walk out of school and protest. The next day, Connor really ups the ante with some of like those most horrific methods of suppression we know from the civil rights movement, turning fire hoses on protesters, releasing dogs, things like that really start to amp up. Within a week, the JFK administration sends a negotiator to get involved to try to put an end to all the action, the feedback, the police brutality, all these things that are happening. And this wave of action more or less ends on May 10th, where there's this negotiation that is meant to put desegregation into action more officially. And then a couple of weeks after that, on May 23rd of 1963, the Alabama Supreme Court finally orders Connor and all of the other commissioners out of office because he's not the only one who has refused to vacate his office. And then if you just want to think about, if you're someone who maybe hasn't thought about the timeline of the civil rights movement anytime recently, it's just wild to think all of the big things that happen in quick succession from this moment. In August of that same year, August 28th, you have the March on Washington, and MLK delivers the famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which is probably the first thing a lot of people would cite when they hear about Martin Luther King. By September of that year, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, the highly discussed deaths of 4 little girls, happens. And that's horrific for many reasons, but even more horrific when you realize that a big part of what drove the action months earlier has been a history of bombings in Birmingham, Alabama for a very long time. There are other bombings happening in the wake of this action against all these leaders, including Gaston, who I mentioned earlier, has damage sustained to his hotel. And by, November of the same year, we have the JFK assassination. It's this big moment. So many things are happening. So many wheels are moving. But the thing that comes out of this from a literary perspective that means the most to me is this letter from Birmingham Jail, where Martin Luther King responds to the clergymen who called him out as an extremist who was making the wrong choice in the wrong moment. And he tries to explain himself and defend direct action and nonviolence. I would say the major points in this letter are MLK outlining the steps you have to take for a successful nonviolent campaign, trying to articulate why people cannot just wait for justice to arrive. He tries to define the difference between a just law and an unjust law. He advocates for nonviolence as the only really constructive path forward in this fight. he expresses frustration with white moderates and people who nominally support desegregation, but are not really actively working to support it. And those are really like the big takeaways. So despite the fact that I didn't do one of my traditional summaries, that was a lot, but I really wanted to give us as much of a contextual framework to work with as possible. So Kris, Chuck, do you have anything you want to critique or add to that context?
I think first and foremost, I appreciate the very clear, in most cases, I don't subscribe to being linear, but like very linear timeline of events that led up to it, because I will agree that most people think of Dr. Martin Luther King's like speeches and words around those that he shared on August 28th in Washington. But as we'll come to learn in this conversation and more, he really like bit his teeth in his leadership with this letter from a Birmingham jail. And I think I'm interested to hear like Kris's take on it, because it's very few and far between that I get a chance to actually get a illustration of all of the things that like led up to it. And then later in the conversation, I'll get a chance to share with you all some pretty like personal experiences that were shared with me by way of my mom, who grew up in the era, as well as a couple of other members of my family. But just passing over to you, Kris.
Yeah, Randy, I think this was a great approach to the synopsis tonight, because the context is complicated. I think you illustrated the web of it all really, really well, because I think that's important to the points that Dr. King was trying to make in the letter. And we'll get there and we'll talk more about it. But ultimately, these actions cannot be understood in isolation, right? The specific actions being condemned by the clergy, the specific response from Dr. King, they can't be considered in isolation. They're part of a great, great context with many layers of complexity. So I hope we can peel back some of those layers tonight. I think you started us off in a really, really great vein here. Well, with that, Chuck, I'm glad that you mentioned the ongoing conversation, because we're getting ready to transition to what I think is the real meat and potatoes of a media lit podcast, and it's our personal connection to the media that's at hand here. Now, normally, this is a conversation about a story that we love, a piece of media, a movie, a television show, or a song. And tonight, it's a very different piece of media. And the ways in which you relate to this are very different than our traditional guest. And so it's important to me that as we enter this conversation, I reiterate, this is a safe space, as you highlighted before. And so, yeah, let's get into it. First and foremost, growing up here, what do you remember about the way in which MLK was taught to you, either in school or elsewhere, in your earliest exposures to the letter from Birmingham?
Yeah, man. So it wouldn't be me if I didn't take some time to also curate a set of resources. So I'll be sharing with you all tidbits in this conversation from a couple of different resources. But the first one being the multi-curriculum reform, the approaches to multi-curriculum reform by a guy by the name of James Banks. And so it's really important to note that, like, when you asked that question, I learned about Martin Luther King in a contributory approach, right? So, like, oftentimes when you look at history and culture, for those that may not always understand the importance of why you would want to teach someone about the contributions of people that may not look or sound or be where you're from, it's because it's actually the lowest level, right? So like in Bloom's taxonomy, remembering is the lowest level, right? Like I know your name, Kris, but if I can't analyze the behavior of Kris, or apply the wisdom and knowledge of Kris or create a beard that's half as good as Kris, then I really don't know Kris, right? And so I learned about the approach of I learned about I learned about multi-tiered curriculum reform when I want to say, man, it might have been like 10 years ago when I first got into Connecticut. By this genius lady. Super shout outs to the great Allie Brown out of Vermont. She was managing director of history at the time at this charter school network that I was at. And she was just like, the way we're teaching history is all wrong. One. Two, she would later be highlighted as Aspen Next Gen Parahera Institute recipient. So she's like a boss, right? And then three, she would go on to found Relay School of Education. So it's like, it's not only is she like really smart, but she's like accomplished, right? So like I'm sitting in this room with her and she's talking to me about the contributory approach. And then she goes into like this, ethnic additive approach where essentially you look at like participants describe how a particular lesson and it's still very surface level, right? It's still like because they were this, then this was essential to that. And to be honest with you, that's not again higher education or a higher level of thinking. But then she pushed us all to start thinking about this notion and understanding of really appreciating the decision making and social action approach, which then goes into essentially like what actions should we study as leadership to reduce prejudice and discrimination, both in schools. And so when I first learned about Martin Luther King, I learned about him from the experience of like my grandmother, my mom, and folks around my neighborhood and pastors that were a part of the coalition that he was also a part of. But when we got to school, I found it to be very I would say diluted for lack of a better term. Like I grew up in a very southern rural town that was divided by a train track and wealth was on one side and underprivilegedness was on another and I was at the latter. But when I got into North Carolina A&T, I started realizing that like, man, all of this stuff is connected. And so not to, use this as a shameless plug, but shout out to North Carolina A&T and the Aggies, because while all of this timeline that you are illustrated earlier, Randy, is being done, there's a group of 4 individuals that are simply teenagers. They're babies. They're known as the A4 now, but they kick a lot of this stuff off in North Carolina. And they kick off this the sit-in movement that then goes into the civil rights movement, which then only furthers the call for Dr. King's Birmingham or letters from the Birmingham jail. And it's like the perfect storm of like social change and like radical action. Now, the kicker is that all of America was not ready for this at the time. And oftentimes Dr. King was seen as a super Uncle Tom or a safe Negro or just different things to just like undermine the fact that like what he was actually talking about was revolutionary at the time. And then also more than brilliant, because if these are the same people that can put you in solitary confinement to where you can only get a phone call from the president of the United States of America, whom would later die. These are the same people. And I'm not saying this with reverence for these people. I'm saying it with reverence for the times and his brilliance that require a different level of gangster, for lack of a better term. So I say all that to say that like when you think about why the letter from a Birmingham jail is so impactful, provocative, inspiring, and empowering, it's because when you look at the multi-step approach to curriculum reform, this is also the multi-step approach to social action reform and how leaders now actually inspire, set direction, and mobilize. And so there's one quote that I really wanted to just like kick this thing off. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This notion of like belonging and justice in King's message connects and emphasizes justice and equality to the passion of actually belonging. And like when I wrote my design charrette coming out of COVID, and Kris and I were both like managers in Boston during this time, and it was such a interesting time because you're starting to see that people forgot what belonging was. And then you started seeing people forgot what equality was. Now, this is 50 years ago after this letter's wrote, and we're only inside for 2 years. So now the cause and effect of that is that people are actually exposed to a level of injustice being anywhere and are no longer seeking to neutralize the threat. And so like my last point on this is when you look at like why this time was so important, why this letter is so enlightening, it really comes down to the fact that King talked about a level of urgency for both educational equality as well as systemic equality that was ahead of his time. And he really kind of gives us the tools for social change and how to appropriately hold those accountable who appropriate power and privilege from a biased and bigoted sense.
Brother Chuck, I am not surprised you came so prepared to speak on this and the approach with which we should learn about these things, right? Not just your own personal experience, but wisdom in general for the approach that we ought to have for topics like these. Not also surprised to hear you highlight the difference between your lived experience that educated you about Dr. King versus like your initial experience in the educational system where you grew up. Disappointing, but not surprising to hear.
Nah, for sure, brothers. Like, I think it's a really interesting parallel because I always tell people this, like growing up in the South is like the story of the fox and the hound, right? So like one day the foxes are out, in the field and a hound runs out there and they're like, oh my God, like, is this one of us? It's a hound? And the other fox is like, no, that's a puppy. Like, be careful because you may not know, but when he gets older, he's going to get our scent. He's going to actually chase us. And I use that analogy because when I grew up in the South, I grew up at a time where a lot of this work had already been done. You know, despite the political climate now, like North Carolina is still a top 3 state and it's not 3 in the country. And it came down to really people having like a level of sacrifice of understanding, well, whether if you're the fox or the hound and you're the one that's chasing or being chased, at some moment in time, you're going to stop and you're going to ask yourself, what are you chasing each other for? And so my mom actually was a pivotal part of that. She was, I think, one of the first integrated classes at her school, school where I would later go to high school. And that community, both rural and I would say junior in terms of the development, it just became a constant understanding of like, yeah, we know like how things are and how things are perceived to be, but the reality is that as people, we are better. As people, we can find ways to say, all right, I like to hunt and fish. I like to play football, basketball. You like playing baseball. But at the end of the day, we're going to find ways to make it not only stick for our families, but also at the same time, we're not going to hide behind prejudice. Because at the end of the day, when you think about just bringing it back to the letter, it was a point in time where Dr. King's message actually critiqued white moderation to the importance of psychological safety for spaces where difficult conversations about race and equality did not occur. And he actually said, like, hey, if you want to be here in allyship, you actually have to understand both the plight of this experience, but also at the same time, I need you to be in it with me, bro.
My experience was that the stuff I got, the stuff I was taught about MLK was pretty cursory. It was, I have a dream. And well, I don't know if anyone ever actually said these words to me. It was easy as a young kid to walk away with the impression like MLK came along, fixed it, life was good. And as a high school educator now, I still have kids coming to me with that similar sort of impression. Well-meaning sort of naivete that I also grew up with. Um, I remember doing a middle school book report. I read like a biography of MLK at some point. I could not tell you the name of the book or how good it was. The only thing that stuck with me that was new was learning from that book how much the work of Gandhi's nonviolent campaigns inspired MLK is one of the many pieces of that story. Kris, any early memories for you?
Yeah, you really nailed it there. I think it's shameful to admit now, but that's certainly the impression. MLK came along. There was this wonderful, wonderful movement where people united for social change, and things have been great since.
Yeah.
And I think hand in hand with that, one thing that I really wanted to highlight in this section was that I didn't only feel that this happened and was now settled. I also felt that it happened once upon a time, right? Like the idea that generations of my neighbors lived through these times, that my parents were alive at this time. The idea that this was our present history, not some past event, was really lost on me because every image I was ever shown was in black and white. Every image of the I Have a Dream speech was in black and white.
Mm-hmm.
That's, for me, where there's a huge miss here. When I see a photo of the I Have a Dream speech, whether up close or from afar, and it's in color, there's something so much more potent and striking and stirring about the reality of the present tense of that moment. And so that wasn't present at all in my early learning about the civil rights movement or Dr. King. I hope that can change.
Speaking of change, I guess what I would say, Kris, is I also want to talk about how our impressions have changed over time. I think that Chuck gave us some insight into that already. So what I will say is, like, in my adult life, slowly but surely it dawned on me how little of this story I really knew or understood. And I think that's going to come to light over the course of our conversation today. But I think if I were just going to simplify how my impression of MLK has changed, I think it's just understanding the full amount of hard work and sacrifice that he and so many countless other people of so many generations put in. Because obviously MLK is one of the most skilled orators of all time, but that's not enough by itself. And I think that's a tough lesson to learn when you're just a kid. And how he's maybe impacted me moving forward. I am inspired by his ability to do that work, and even more so by his openness to sacrifice. This was a man who had attempts on his life before he was assassinated, and he was always very aware that the work he was doing was likely going to end in his own death. And to continue stepping out there into these situations time and time again, I don't know that I could ever summon up that level of bravery or selflessness or sacrifice, but it's sure something to aspire to. Has your understanding of MLK improved or changed over the years, Kris?
It has certainly changed, and I would say it's matured.
Yeah.
right? We won't get into it, but one thing that disingenuous folks today will want to do is highlight the flaws, right?
Sure.
Hold up a hero and let me point out the flaws. It's in those very flaws that I am inspired, right? It's not the acts of a perfect person that inspire me. It is the will of the imperfect person to strive for something better that I find really, really inspiring. And separately from that, on a different topic, I have a newfound respect for MLK as I grow and mature, as I look at the need for change and organization in the world around me. That piece of organization is not something that is taught to us in the cursory exposure we have to the civil rights movement. We're kind of left, I guess, to imagine how it all came together. To your point, Randy, he's a great orator. So, like he gave some speeches. He wrote some things down that people read. They were published and passed about. But just the mechanics of the movement, the level, to your point, of self-sacrifice to make yourself available all hours of the day, any day of the week, month, year, to be available to your community, to travel, to try and rally up support anywhere you can find it, to go into the pool halls, to walk through any street, sharing a message that you profoundly believe in a way that actually effectively brings people together. That is something that was lost on me. And I think that like how to organize social change is a course in and of itself. Him as a social organizer blows my mind today.
Yeah. And then thank you, Kris. That was awesome. And then Chuck, you talked a little bit about how your impression has evolved over time. But what are some of the ways that like MLK and his work is kind of part of who you are, your values, your style, your day-to-day life?
I think for me, MLK is going to go down as the archetype of what leadership can and should be in this lifetime and in the next. And the reason why I say that is because the other day I had a chance to sit in a training on leadership. And I'm an introspective guy. Like I always try my best to take one thing and apply it to another. But in this training, we're going over these 4 different like dichotomies or archetypes for leadership. And I'll be really quick as I share them with you all. But like the first one is a collaborator, right? Works side by side with someone, highly responsive to their needs, occasionally asserting authority, right? Then you have a champion, and this champion guides and educates by combining some authority, usually in the form of like wisdom and experience, and with doses of responsiveness. They give the theme of this is important, you can do it, and I believe in you. Then you have like a conceiver, and they lead based on an authority of a vision, right? So like, let me paint a picture for you. This works best when a group really needs like a rally cry for a distant goal or belief in things unseen, And then the last one is a captain. And the captain primarily uses authority to say, I need you to do it this way. This approach normally works best in a crisis or an emergency. I now look at Martin Luther King's leadership as the summary point of that training, which is that great leadership vacillates between these 4 different dichotomies, and they differentiate themselves based upon the need of those that they're leading, inspiring, or mobilizing. And to bring it back to the Birmingham letter, Dr. King does this so eloquently, like in the most sincere and truthful way. He basically says, either you're with me or against me. And lastly, he says, this understanding of education is both my life's work and my committed life's work. A lot of people forget that Martin Luther King graduated high school like what, 14, 12, like some incredibly young number. And then he goes on to like Boston University. And before he goes down to like Morehouse, like he's just a legend. He's a man ahead of his time. And so, to answer your question concretely, for me, I think it's about being able, I think leadership by Martin Luther King is defined as being able to stay aligned with the virtue of who you are while also being able to inspire others to honestly change the virtue of what they don't know. And so there is no blind spot for Martin Luther King and his legacy of what he didn't do. Like, you have to ask yourself, and you all stay in the greater Boston area, how would they put a statue of this man giving a hug to his wife in the middle of Boston if he didn't do the things that we both outlined in this conversation and things that we really encourage folks to go learn about?
Fun fact, when Kris and I got together back in December, we actually took a little stroll past that statue. So there you go.
So good. So good. I still haven't seen it, but I'll be back to Boston soon.
It's a beautiful achievement. It really is.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible. One question that I have for the two of you guys, if you don't mind, Randy.
Please.
And this is just like on the notion of leadership. Like, when you look at the letter within itself, what's one thing that inspires you as the person that you are, as well as someone who seeks to make the generation coming behind him even better?
Dude, that's such an incredible question, but I actually think I have the answers here in my notes, but I'm going to do my best from memory. I think in terms of, what I maybe see in myself, obviously I could never be on any level near Martin Luther King. But obviously he's so full of love, and caring. But what I love is that, like, he's got that spark of fire in him. Like, he is not afraid to push back with a little bit of attitude. I can do that less eloquently than MLK, and not always still manage to get my my point across. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, like, he is speaking to how desperately he needs people to be in this fight with him, how desperately he needs allies, and how much sacrifice that takes. And I can find moments in my life where I've stepped up closer to be making a personal sacrifice, and I can identify moments in my life where there's a lot of room to grow there. So I think it's an aspirational thing for me to remember that, if I see a problem and I want to see it change, I can't just want it to change. Like, I need to be taking risks. I need to be putting myself out there. I need to be speaking up. So I hope that answers your question, but I think that's partly why I read and reread this letter so much, is it reminds me of that.
That was beautifully said. Thank you so much for sharing.
The biggest thing that stands out to me in the way MLK wrote this letter, and I think the way he generally approached teaching, preaching, sharing a message, there's this wonderful open-handedness. He does not condescend or insult, but to your point, Randy, he doesn't ever negotiate truth either, right? And that's maybe where you're pointing to a certain kind of fire with which he can convict people, right? There's a certain use of language he has that gets to the truth of a thing, a certain truth that we all hold deep inside here. Now, he contextualizes that in his writing, in a Christian sense. He knows that that's his audience. He'll assert that the American dream is rooted in Judeo-Christian values because that's the community he's coming from and that he's writing to. But those same points can be made in speaking to any audience because these are truths that are deeply understood inside the human being. And how often it's easier to get at those kinds of truths than a one-on-one conversation. You can lead somebody down a path of empathetic conversation where it's like using empathy in partnership with logic to get people to begin to open their mind to the plight of others or to a particular injustice. One-on-one, that can be done. Individuals are often more reasonable and more empathetic, and to do that to a group is extremely challenging, something that Martin Luther King does so artfully, Randy, to your point, so eloquently. But I really think he's able to do so and appeal to such a mass group in this way because of his lack of fear, his conviction for the truth. While he does not seek to insult, he does not seek to further alienate anybody who might read his letters, he is not shying away from truth. And that's the kind of leader that I would hope to be. That's the kind of inspiration I would hope to share with the next generation. When we adhere to truth, we will find light. Period.
Yep. It's so good, fellas. I got one more thing I want to share with you all. I think, man, it's been so long. So like, I was a principal for 4 years. Now I'm an educational consultant, and I ask questions like that because I find that leadership is the hardest thing to balance in a world where there are so many moving parts. There's so many like obstacles. A letter from the Birmingham Jail is a incredible artifact on how to stand in your truth and leverage conviction so that you are inspiring, setting direction, and mobilizing. But I think the kicker in that is that you often have to understand, what do you stand for as a leader and what do you stand for as a system. And I learned this over my years. And I think this again might have been like before my Boston time, Kris, but just like leading for equity, I shared it with you guys, is a really dope framework on how to be a technical and rational leader. And if you're a listener to this podcast and a part of this learning community, I really want to illustrate the power in being a lifelong learner. A learner that learns without bias, a learner that qualifies based upon experience, and a learner that challenges and validates in actions. And that's not necessarily for social change, but that's just for a broader perspective. When I have conversations with Kris, I often think back to a specific detail, and a conversation that we'll have often over the years is, the significance and innovation of a character that we love. Randy, if you hang out with Kris, I know you had a Batman conversation.
Oh, yeah. One or two.
Right. So I say that to say that, like, just to use that as an example, there's no time that we inflate judgment so that we then walk away with a chip or, a set of validation, but we actually suspend judgment and leverage compassion in a way that says like, man, you know what? I didn't know that detail on that car was designed this way, or this suit was particular for this type of mission that Batman may have been on. And so I say that to say that, like, Martin Luther King gave his life for us to be able to understand how to learn, how to do so with compassion, and then also at the same time, to Kris's point, how to not leverage hate for those who may not be learning like how we do. And these days and times, it's a critical skill to just constantly develop, because you'll be surprised how much it'll mean to you when you have it, and how much you'll miss it when you don't.
Man, beautifully stated. And I'm grateful that you've begun to bring us closer to talking about the letter directly. But before we move on, I wanted to highlight the resources you've shared so far in this call.
Yeah.
To the listeners at home, we will have these linked in the show notes for this one. You'll probably find them in a posting on the website, but also in the show notes. You'll find a link to some of these things that Chuck has been talking about in case you're curious and you want to take a closer look. Let's talk more about the letter itself. But I guess before we do that, I do want to at least ask a question about the letter that sparked the letter that came from the United Clergy. So this might be a historical document. It was written now some many, many decades ago. But does it feel relevant to us today? Randy, I'll go to you first on this.
Yeah, so we're talking about this letter that these clergymen released kind of condemning MLK and other members of the movement, arguing that their actions were unwise, that their actions were going to precipitate violence, that they should wait for the courts to handle all of this. And they were writing it from a place where they felt that they were being very supportive. And of course we would like to see an end to segregation, but you can't do it in this manner. And I find this so deeply relevant, because I see this consistently, even in my world that I live in, that I've described on a day-to-day basis. We are living in a political moment right now where conversations get tense and difficult. Something that has made it into the halls of my school district are like debates and questions about like challenging books that should be allowed in libraries and in schools, and in curriculums. And while I do think ultimately those have been handled pretty well in the place where I work, even if no one has successfully removed a book from our libraries, they've successfully quieted people down. They've made people scared. They've made people start questioning what topics they're going to talk about. And I find that really frustrating from my perspective. I find myself wanting to voice louder opposition, and a lot of people disagreeing with that sentiment. And that's where this clergy letter sounds familiar, because I think when things get tense and that tension comes to the surface and it makes people uncomfortable and it challenges the status quo, there are certain people who are very comfortable in their positions of authority who not only will prefer the safer status quo response. What's the path of least resistance I can get to making this problem go away? But they will convince themselves that they are right. And if I had a nickel for every time I've heard someone in authority take on this very condescending, paternalistic tone to say that you just don't understand that this is not a wise course of action, thankfully, I, the pragmatic person in charge, am here to explain to you hot-headed youths that you need to keep your mouths shut. And I've seen that play out in so many circumstances. But that's one in particular where it hits me.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that you had such a specific application. Not to undermine public education by any means or the structures within it, but I can imagine the bureaucracy of administration must be maddening sometimes. Anyways, Chuck.
I think this is a very powerful and pivotal moment, both in this conversation and the next, to Randy's point, because it's political. It's a political moment for the country. But to go back to the letter, and to be frank, Martin Luther King responded to the 8 clergymen from my perspective and experience, saying, you're appropriating my struggle based off of the privilege that you have and say of my struggle. So it's like, how can you at some moment in time suspend your judgment to understand that if he didn't protest nonviolently, he would have lost his ability to be considered even a reverend, a pastor in this, ecosystem of clergymen. And then the second one is, it was just a quote that I wrote down, and I have it here in my notes, but he says, sometimes a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. And when you think about freedom of speech or any one of his amendments, he knew that there was a double standard or a level of consideration that he was not seen as a person deserving of that law, but in humility still acted in a way that allowed for conviction, and his leadership and his commitment to those around him, to later have a greater level of both appreciation of said law in addition to uh, enhancements of those laws. Um, and so, yeah, just to summarize, I just think, the response to the clergyman is really about them not appropriating his struggle for the privilege that they have and the privilege that he has not, that he's acting for in his leadership.
Yep. For me, when I revisited this clergy letter, I think it made me as angry as the response made me inspired, because this was the gaslighting in it is so familiar, and that's where I feel it's so relevant today. It's so frustrating to read this letter because it feels like it could have been written today. You have a power structure writing to the people in an open letter published in the newspaper, undermining the efforts of legitimately marginalized people and trying at the same time to paint a rosy picture of the conditions. I'm looking for the quote now so that I can get it correct. "We do not believe," they wrote, "that these days of new hope are days when extreme measures are justified in Birmingham." They have the audacity, in the face of the conditions that prompted such action as Martin Luther King has been jailed for, to write that these are days of new hope. That, to me, is sickeningly familiar to the kind of outright gaslighting we see in today's political environment. And it's the extreme contrast of this letter to Martin Luther King's that I think highlighted the truth that I spoke of before, because this is so deeply untruthful, and his response obliterates it because it is so deeply truthful. That's what we need today.
All right. So we talked a little bit about the letter that is kind of the last straw that sparks this response from Martin Luther King. But it is time finally to dig deep, deep, deep into the letter itself, because not only does it have political importance, not only does it teach us, not only is it informative, but it's also beautifully written. And before we get too deep into the nitty gritty of some of our favorite quotes from this incredibly quotable piece of writing, I wanted to ask a little bit more broadly about the tone that Martin Luther King takes in this letter. And, I guess I'm also curious, which audiences do you think he has in mind? He is clearly writing most directly to the clergyman, but I also think it's clear that he has a sense of some larger audiences in mind. So what's the tone, and how do you feel about it, and who do you think he's speaking to? Chuck, I'm going to go straight to you on this one, because I suspect when you saw this one on the outline, you were pretty excited to talk about it.
Yes. And so, all right, I thought this was a really interesting take, because greatness is never making it seem harder than what it is. Like, oh man, it's a type of drawing where it's just like the pen never moves, never up.
Like a continuous line drawing?
Continuous line drawing.
Yeah.
And he gives a continuous line drawing, if you will, of a piece that he's not writing it out of anger. He's not writing it out of malice. He's writing it from a level of peace and urgency and not to be spiritual here, but it's just like a level of anointing in his fruits of the Spirit. How he is so clear that this is not only why he's saying it, but how he says it. It's non-confrontational. And I think the emotional intelligence for someone, we all get emails all the time, and I think we may count the number of exclamation marks in an email and say well, that's very exciting, right there, right? everything he wrote in the letters from a Birmingham jail was with a period, and his diction was composed, humble, and meek at times, because it allowed for the reader to then say at some point in time, is he talking to me? Yeah, he's talking to you. If you feel a level of self-limiting belief, it's not because Martin Luther King intended you to have a less than moment. It's because you read what he wrote in the tone of what he wrote from a level of humility and transparency. And then when you look at the response, those there of the 8 clergymen, I promise you, at least 5 said, well, he's right.
Yep.
Some moment in time across their lives.
Yep.
Some of them, at least 5 said, you know what, he's right. Thanks so much for that question, Randy. I took in, if you couldn't tell, a couple of different approaches at just trying to just synthesize, like, well, was it this emotion or this emotion? And the fact was that there was no emotion.
Dude, I'm just glowing over here because that was like a very like AP language and composition analysis of what's going on with Martin Luther King. So I'm right in my English teacher glory. I think you got right to the bottom of what I was hoping to cover with that question. Kris, do you have any thoughts on like just the overall tone and who MLK is speaking to?
Yeah, not anything more eloquent than Chuck already had to say, but I too was struck by the calmness of it, right? Despite having passion, there's no anger. None of his words or points are clouded by that. There are no threats in this letter. There's no shaming done in this letter. And yet, to your point, Chuck, at least 5 of these clergymen specifically, and I assume many others who read this, felt shame in reading it. And it's because, again, he speaks clear, open-handed truth. If I sense any emotion at all, it's a sense of disappointment. In fact, I think he uses that word quite a few times. Disappointment. Right? He's ultimately, ostensibly, writing this letter to these clergymen, right? It's as a response to their letter. And in that way, he's writing to peers. And he speaks their language. And he appeals to all the same sources of wisdom that he knows they hold dear. And in doing so, he expresses this deep disappointment that they don't see what he sees so clearly. Right? And so to that point, to answer the rest of your question, Randy, I think it's dangerous for us ever to assume that an author who wrote something at a time in a place intended it for me at some other point in history. Right? Like, I think it's dangerous for us to take a historical text and say, what is this trying to say to me? But that doesn't mean it has nothing to say to me or is not relevant to me in some way. But this in particular, I do think this author absolutely was aware that this letter would be widely read. I do believe it was written with the intention to inspire many to both conviction of their own beliefs, right? And hopefully action. I believe this was a strategic action by a brilliant leader, not just a truth teller. As I highlighted earlier, I've come to respect this strategist, this organizer. And I feel this was strategy, right? That this was published widely for a reason. He could have sent it directly, but it was published for a reason. And I do believe that he knew this would be something akin. I don't want to be heavy-handed. It's like something akin to scripture, right? Like Paul says that all scripture is good for teaching. I do think that Martin Luther King knew that he was writing something down that would continue to be read and would have an influence on future generations.
Yeah, for sure, Kris. I mean, we just look at that timeline of events. There are so many different versions of this letter out there in the world. Like, you've got the original longhand version that, like any good writer would do. He certainly did some editing and cleaning up for that letter once he made it out of that Birmingham prison. It was published in different newspapers, magazines, etc. in all those months as the coverage of all these bombings in Birmingham and other things are starting to get the attention and coverage that they deserve. And the world is changing. And all of a sudden, we're mobilizing the FBI in September when that 16th Street bombing happens, whereas that's not where these investigations were going up to that point. So maybe he couldn't have predicted the full extent, but yeah, he certainly, I think, hopes other people are going to read it. And fortunately for all of us, they did, because it was such a leap of faith for him to make that decision that day. There are so many reasons that we would not have held against him if he had decided maybe today is not the day.
Mm-hmm.
But that was the day, and he went for it. And people responded because the cause was so just. And it's a beautiful letter. My only slightly different take is I love how eloquent and reserved and respectful this letter is. But I also love that he does include just the right amount of shade. And it makes me love the letter. And quite frankly, Dr. King even more to see him get those little jabs in. I've got a couple, but my favorite flex in the whole letter is right at the beginning. It's too perfect. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that cross my desk, my secretaries, plural, would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. Is such a cool flex.
I'm so glad you went there, Randy, because there is a certain amount of and like Dumbledore does this. It's not snark. It's just, innocently and calmly putting a thing out there that is going to have a layered response to it, right? It's like what it means on the surface and what it means underneath. Yep. For me, it's right at the very end of the letter I wrote down. I'm afraid that it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else is there to do when you're alone for days in the dull monotony of a narrow jail cell, other than write long letters, think strange thoughts, and pray long prayers?
Yeah.
Okay. So
I don't want to take up your precious time. Of course, I would hate to, but what else, Shame on me for being in jail.
There's so many bangers of his letter, though. The one that I took down, I was just like, oh, like he drops the pen. It is first, I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. And at this moment in time, it's like you got these theologians, and if anybody's abreast of just like how much these people read, study, like refine, and they get here, and he's just like, I'm just not impressed with your life's work.
Brother, it's like when Jesus asks a Sadducee, oh, have you read the scriptures? These are people whose whole life was about being immersed in being the authority on the scriptures. I'm so glad you highlighted that.
It's like that moment when Nicodemus is like, yeah, like you are the Messiah. I was wilding.
Yeah.
Kris, you had a take earlier that I was like, you know what? I that resonates and I get it. But after reading this quote, I was just like, nah, like this is greatness, guys. Like, and the point specifically I'm mentioning, my brother, is to say that something was written then was for us today, because this right here, it's either two-part, right? Either it was meant for us today or history repeats itself. It could be both.
Yep.
So the quote goes, we are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. And like, when you look at what's happening on a national level, and in some cases a global level, there's a consistent fight against the upward mobility of lifelong learners and people who have chosen to say, hey, I really want to make the world a better place for both you and me. And then I also love the fact that when you look at the letter at its construct, and I think Kris, you had a point earlier about Judea. I apologize, just being a part of like Christianity. There's a quote that goes, ultimately, was not Jesus an exorcist or a extremist for love. And that's honestly what he's advocating for inside of this letter.
Mm.
Basically saying, how dare you not love us in a way in which we've chosen to love you, because we've chosen to not use violence in the ways that we express love for you, for equality for us. Dr. Martin Luther King is brilliant. And when he writes that, you know it's coming from a place of just like pure intelligence.
Yeah. You said it before, emotional intelligence. It's all over this letter. The emotional intelligence is a ridiculous high. Well, we're doing quotes now, so I guess let's get into it. Randy, what do you think? Maybe a little round table style.
Yeah,
jump around the letter. Favorite bangers from the body.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. We'll roll around that. This letter is so thematically tight that it almost doesn't matter what order we hit the quotes in, because it's that continuous line drawing we were just talking about. It all comes full circle, perfect structure. Yeah, let's dig into it.
Lovely. Why don't you give us your first favorite quote then, Randy? We'll stay with you.
All right, perfect. So I know exactly what my favorite quote is. And ironically, this quote does not appear in the version of Letter from Birmingham Jail that is otherwise my favorite, in terms of just like the final phrasings that made it through in the edit. But if I had to simplify MLK's whole theory about just laws versus unjust laws, when you know nonviolent action is warranted, it is: one who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. And that's it in a nutshell. There's not a lot of protest that happens in the world, both protests that I agree with and protests that I disagree with, that takes all of that into consideration. When MLK goes to prison, he does have friends in high places, but he can't assume he's going to get special help from the President of the United States. He can't assume that singer Harry Belafonte is going to raise $50,000 of bail money to help get people out of prison. But the support starts pouring in because his cause was just. And when you see people fight for change and then complain when they are punished for it, it shows you how disingenuous that action was to begin with.
Yeah, very, very well said. I think he says, for this to work, we have to be willing to walk the walk, right? All the way to the end of the line.
Yep.
Chuck, do you want to start us off with one of your favorite quotes from anywhere within the letter?
I'm gonna remain consistent on this one, but
Nice.
it's the injustice anywhere is the threat.
Yeah.
Injustice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of whatever affects one, affects all indirectly. And the explanation of that is so brilliant, or the understanding of that is so brilliant, because when you look at the times that he faced and the times that we're seeing now, no one is benefiting from a world of racism and hate. Like, at the end of the day, there are still moments where those that may not look like myself still feel uncomfortable when they are at a moment of friction where the thinking of another becomes a whole lot more clear, for lack of a better terms. And it's like how do you like deal with that, right? Like, maybe some speak up on it, maybe some don't. Then there's still like profound racism still happening. So like the world doesn't, it just, whatever happens to one directly affects us all indirectly.
Mm-hmm.
Or even for someone represented both on this call, or I think about the struggles of the everyday woman, and it's just like, again, what affects one directly affects us all indirectly. It was a brilliant quote. That's all, Dr. King.
Yeah, Chuck, that was very top of my list. As I was working through this and I was taking notes as I went along, that was one of the very first quotes that I wrote down because it's so important to the overall message, right? None of this makes any sense if we're not all tied together in a single garment of destiny. I love that. Well, I'll move just a little bit further down then. This is a moment where maybe some of the artful shade we talked about comes into his tone here because, but I think too, more he's speaking their language and shining a light on the kinds of men he expects these clergymen to be and the kinds of citizens he thinks the average American imagines themselves to be when they read this letter. He writes, "You deplore the demonstrations that are presently taking place in Birmingham, but I am sorry that your statement did not express a similar concern for the conditions that brought the demonstrations into being. I am sure that each of you would want to go beyond the superficial social analyst who looks merely at effects and does not grapple with the underlying causes. I would not hesitate to say that it is unfortunate that so-called demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham at this time, but I would say in more emphatic terms that it is even more unfortunate that the white power structure of this city left the Negro community with no other alternative." It's so hard to argue with sound, truthful logic like that when he first presents to them the kind of person he expects they would want to be. I'm sure you all, and everyone, yes, of course, well, I'm not superficial. And then to be brought to the conclusion of that paragraph, it's one of these moments in the letter where he could have almost stopped at any point because like the message has been sent. It's perfectly encapsulated there. How can you possibly condemn these actions without further condemning the conditions that made these actions necessary?
Yeah, but before I go into my next one, Kris, I just want to yes and you on that, right? Because a little bit closer to the end of the letter, he harkens back to that because he points out like, oh, by the way, I also don't really love how you took the time to applaud the police because maybe at this point in the process, the stuff that's made it on camera has seemed pretty respectful and peaceful. But things are pretty ugly here in the prison. If you could see what people are saying to us, how they are treating the people who are arrested from this protest in the prison, I don't think you'd be speaking quite so glowingly of that experience.
You can see the teeth of the attack dog sinking into the arms. Yeah, he didn't pull any punches there.
Yeah, although my next one, Kris, I hope you're not too upset with me. I would love to hear your thoughts on this one. I'm stealing your brand a little bit because like one of my favorite quotes in this entire letter is like the ultimate girl dad moment. But it's also meaningful to me because we've had plenty of podcasts, and this is going to start up again, where I'm going to be coming in and being like, oh, hey, I just went to Six Flags with my son. My son sending me to this roller coaster. And we get this quote in the middle of this almost paragraph long compound sentence where Martin Luther King is listing up all of the examples of injustice that make it impossible to wait. And he covers the full gamut from the most horrific violent crime down to the smallest microaggressions. But the one that me, as someone who's not lived this experience, has the easiest time feeling, that brings a tear to my eye every time I read it, is this description of what a segregated world does to his daughter. When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering, as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she cannot go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her little eyes when she's told that Funtown is closed to colored children and see the depressing clouds of inferiority begin to form in her little mental sky, and see her begin to distort her little personality by unconsciously developing a bitterness toward white people. Like, floors me. And this is not me trying to compare my own experience. My point is how disconnected my experience is. But like, I can barely handle the disappointment of when my 5-year-old was not like tall enough to ride a ride at the amusement park. So like, when I think about this time of year where a big topic of conversation with my sons are just like innocent, carefree conversations about how excited they are to go to an amusement park, to imagine someone being in the middle of that conversation and having to hit the brakes on it to say, oh yeah, we can't go there. You're not welcome at this amusement park. Why is that? This innocent conversation of love and fun has to be elevated to the stakes of segregation. And while it's not the affront that's the most horrific of every example on the list, it's the most alive. And then that imagery of a storm clouding up her mental sky is so powerful. When I teach this in high school, some of the language goes over the heads of some of my students, but no one's ever had a hard time understanding that example.
I can't imagine, to your point, Randy, there's like certain realities that will help our children face in this world. But generally for my daughter, it will be the kinds of things that are sort of a part of this world. Like your pet will have to die someday, right? We're going to have to say goodbye to Mimi and Papa someday. There's certain things that feel unjust or heartbreaking in this world. They're just a part of life. But that's not what this is. These are our self-imposed wounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
These kinds of realities that he's speaking about having to face with his daughter. I can't imagine the added level of heartbreak and frustration in that moment, knowing that this is the choice of unjust humans, not some reality of the natural world, but rather just cruelty. And having to help a child accept that is a totally different thing that I can't relate to.
Randy, I appreciate you for sharing that level of like empathy and connection, especially as it relates to like you being a father. I think that within itself speaks volumes about who you are and why you approach the work you do with such commitment and veracity. But or not, but and I think there's another. This is such a rich piece of literature because shortly after he says that about his daughter and her having that lived experience, Kris, I appreciate your sentiment about, you know, that also still being a part of life, unfortunately, that we have to explain. He then like just he goes from like jab to like uppercut to like hook, where he then brings the application of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the piece around civil disobedience. And the quote goes, of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidenced and subliminally in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. And some may say like, all right, yeah, we get like what he's talking about with like civil disobedience, but it's the brilliance of knowing that the greater audience of those who are Christian and Jewish understand when you say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they're inside of that furnace, they were actually standing beside Jesus. And that within itself is a phenomenal like leverage of his pen, because if you're really about that life, you're gonna say, man, we were just like Nebuchadnezzar. And we're now condemning someone who is a part of the practice of what we believe, and we can't justify anything other than he's black, right? Um, there's a couple of different things that I think he does probably better than we've ever seen. Like, and this is with all respect and great reverence towards those of the Jewish faith. But he also brings up a German uh, reference that I think is probably the best of its kind, in parallel to the Christian reference, in parallel to the African American Negro experience.
Mhm.
And I'll just leave that at that, because it's evident that he's, again, thoughtfully and unemotionally writing from a place of intelligence. It's different. It's really different.
No, I'm so glad you highlighted that quote. I had that one written down as well, because again, I think I said this before. He knows his audience. He knows who will be reading this, and these are truths that everybody has. Well, I should say everybody, but the Bible reading, Bible believing communities will respond to if they have any ounce of authenticity in their bodies, right? With a statement like this, he's basically challenging, are you who you say you are? Do these things mean anything to you really? Are they just words, or do they inspire your actions? Because if they do, there's only one logical conclusion from that. And I think he's brilliant in his use of rhetoric there. I want to take it back to his discussion of the white moderate and his condemnation of that particular type, because I find today this commentary is particularly potent. And so in response to the idea from the white moderate that time cures all ills, Dr. King wrote, actually, time is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. I am coming to feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. That kind of sentiment, no matter how it's phrased, because you can find ideas like that elsewhere, it always cuts deep into my heart. It makes me really have a gut check moment about whether or not I am a silent good person. Because as a silent good person, I'm doing more harm to this world than the loud, ill-willed person. That's just the truth. Because in complicity is all that evil needs to flourish. Right? Your silence is permission. And with permission, evil acts boldly. And then it believes it acts with authority. And so it's so important today that we're in touch with this idea. This generation is going to have to repent. Not just because of the vitriolic words. And my goodness, do we hear some vitriolic words of ill-meaning people, but because of the appalling silence of so many.
That's so good.
Yeah, I love that one, Kris. And I love how he refers to that as the myth of time, which is such a great way to frame it. And it just goes hand in hand with all of the things he is saying about how desperately action needs to be taken. Like that notion that shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will, because you know where you stand. And yeah, how do you fight that when people are saying they support you? You want to believe them, and then that support doesn't really come.
It's that falseness is so much more dangerous. It's so much more deadly.
We're just piggybacking off of the white moderate, right?
Yeah.
really not trying to get like too deep here. But Dr. King's sentiments on, I must confess that over the past few years, I've been greatly disappointed with the white moderates. It's similar to how I feel about the folks that reached out to me and asked for careful ways of considering and unlearning when we all publicly watched the killing of George Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
It's pathetic because now, years later, when the climate changes, that moderation is now able to be leveraged in a different political sense. And it still allows you, to Kris's point, to remain complicit if you chose to be silent long enough. And I think there's still great work to be done as we continue to discuss like directly and address this notion of like safety and belonging so that we're able to actualize inclusivity. Like when you read the letter, he's calling for equal treatment for those that look like him and those that don't. And those that don't look like him are being called to the carpet for a level of scrutiny that they are causing, like AKA you're making this hard, guys. And then B, a level of I knew you were going to make it hard. I love you anyway. And my love for you is to not mobilize this how the rest of my community sees for me to mobilize it, which then causes me scrutiny, right? Like, and me as in like Martin Luther King, because a large portion of Black America during that time looked at Dr. King as the safe Negro, while Malcolm X was seen as the militant Negro. And I only use it in that terms, in that context, because that's how we identified ourselves in that day. It's not a less than moment, but it was later on in King's life and X's life that they both realized that it was like Xavier and Magneto.
Yeah.
Like they had to pursue what they did, how they did, for the world to be what we know it as today. And so when we talk about like the moderate, I think that's also a constant conversation around those who may not fully abreast Kris's point around silence and complacency. And that may not always look like, you know, a person that is in opposition of the natural color of what you may be, but that also may look like you not doing the work from your own lens too.
Yeah.
And bigoting yourself with silence. Cause you just want to like say, hey, let's let it all figure out.
We can just get along. Why can't we just, why can't we just try to get along?
Yeah, Chuck, like one thing I had in my notes, I wasn't sure when I was going to bring it up, but you sparked it. And there was a night in 2020. I forget if it was late May or early June 2020, but it was during like the widespread George Floyd protests across the nation, across the world. I was in COVID lockdown. I was not in a good place. I was probably being much too free with my words and thoughts on social media, as so many of us were in that particularly dark moment. But there was one night, there was a protest on the Boston Common that was peaceful. And I think I just left the news on until like 3:00 in the morning. I think I like literally sat there for like 8 hours, just like watching. I like left it on like the CBS local news or whatever, just watching this unfold, watching how there was like this heavily armed SWAT force waiting for this protest to end, just waiting to egg on something. And, you know, there's a rough night in Boston and, you know, there was some vandalism, there was some looting, but I sat there for like 6 or 7 or however many hours I was sitting there just like staring, and I was just watching the news affiliate spend almost no time on the root causes. So like I'm thinking letter from Birmingham Jail. They must have showed like the same clip of someone coming out of a convenience store with like some bags of chips like 25 times. I'm not suggesting that they should have ignored the well-being of the police officers or the police force, but that was the only narrative coming through this entire thing. I'm not saying they had to ignore property damage, but I it was like a train wreck situation. I was desperately waiting to hear some more depth to this coverage or this discussion, and in that dark moment, I was like, man, like I'm just feeling this letter and this moment and these concerns, and I've never really quite forgotten that night because something started to hit me that day harder than it ever had before. It wasn't a new thought, but it reached a new level.
It's such an apt comparison. It's incredible that it's such an apt comparison. But it's exactly what, like that quote I shared earlier. Like, how dare you condemn these actions, which are the result of a greater injustice? So, of course, no, looting and property damage, those things are not good. Violence is not good, and that's regrettable. But more regrettable is the things that caused them to be. I remember those days that you're reflecting on.
Yeah, I have a personal story for it. So, it's very interesting that you bring up that moment for you watching the TV during COVID lockdown. I was living in East Boston, off Maverick Street, and I remember watching the city erupt across the water with my son. He might have been 6, 7 years old. And he looks at me and he says, "Daddy, why is the city fighting?" It because of the man that we essentially heard had died. And I was like, yeah. He was like, well, why don't we go and fight too? And I said, well, you know what, bud? One, you're too young. And two, this isn't how you fight things like that. And it's okay for people to fight and use their voice and to mark. Like, that's what the greats have done. However, the way you fight this is by you becoming the best version of yourself and living the longest version of your life that you possibly can. And at that moment in time, I felt a level of conviction because I was like, I don't want my son to grow up and be, afraid to like speak his voice about things that matter. But I also, at the same time, going back to that reference of the fox and the hound, really don't have time to be explaining to my young fox when he's realizing that some of his friends at some point in time may end up becoming hounds.
Yeah.
You can take with that what you would like.
Yeah.
It's important to say and name that, like, bringing it back to the letter, that the level of advocacy and direct action for nonviolence essentially defends direct action as a way to create constructive tension.
Yeah.
Well, I think we could keep doing this for hours, trading quotes and continuing this conversation. But we can't do that tonight. However, if any of the podlings at home would like to highlight their own favorite quotes from this conversation, from the letter rather, or any comments on this conversation so far, drop us an email. We have an open inbox for you at all times. You can email us at media.slash.lit@gmail.com. So if there's anything we haven't hit, that's just, it's the juice of the letter for you, please hit us up and we'd love to talk more about it.
I have one more question. A big part of Media Lit is we often tend to do some comparative literature conversations. We try to bring in connections to, other things in the world that have maybe been influenced or share some thematic sort of center with what's been under conversation today. I want to do that. And I also want to keep up the momentum of honoring Dr. King and his legacy. So I'm going to turn to each panelist And I'm going to give you a couple of questions to answer for me. So the first question is going to be, is there any literature or popular culture that came to mind as you were reading and rereading this letter that feels really relevant to the conversation? Perhaps another way society's tried to broach some of these topics that came to mind. And I'd love for everyone to share one of those if you have it. And then I would also love to hear if you have any other favorite MLK writings or speeches that come to mind as you read this letter that people might want to check out. So, Kris, I'm going to go to you first. What do you got for me, man?
Yeah, I'll keep it fairly brief, and I'll let Chuck expound upon this one a little bit further. But maybe this is quite obvious given all of the quotes to Scripture, all the quotes from Scripture throughout the letter. But for me, it's impossible to read the words of Dr. King, to look at the work of his life and not think of Christ and not think of the stories that were told in the New Testament, both in his rhetorical style, his ability to speak truth, to create tension intentionally, right? Dr. King calls that out in the letter that, they want to somehow sort of imply that this is creating undue tension. He's like, no, it's very due tension. In fact, it's quite intentional tension. That is the point. That's much of how Dr. King operated was informed by the way Christ operated. The movement of Christ happened at a time where there were lots of movements happening historically, right? Jews had been oppressed under one regime or another, most recently the Romans, and you had all kinds of takes within their community on how they ought to move forward. Violent resistance was on the table. There were zealots who wanted to take up arms, right, and try and take back the land. And then there was the option of nonviolence. And you highlighted it earlier, the sacrifice that he was willing to make. Chuck, you highlighted that, or perhaps it was you, Randy, that he walked through his work knowing that this would likely be the end of his life. Mm-hmm. That would likely be the conclusion of his work, so that he would not live to be an old man who died a natural death. And we know in Scripture that there is no greater love than to give up one's life for a brother. And so it's impossible for me to read the works of MLK and to look at the work of his life and not think of the New Testament and of Christ's teaching specifically.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, MLK, a reverend, his religion was at the core of his teachings. It was something I know that meant something personal to him, but it was also like a common language he could use when so much of that work was happening, in the Bible Belt, in the Deep South. So, it's important to his work, whether or not you're a listener coming at these words, whether or not you are a Christian. It's so clear how baked in that was. And it's a common language that other people have used as well. About a year ago, we were here chatting about Kurt Vonnegut, "Wailing shall be in all streets." Mm-hmm. Kurt Vonnegut is notably not a Christian, but he loves to talk about Christian themes. He loves to talk about Jesus Christ. And there's something in that shared language that opens up your point to a lot of people. But I'll maybe let Chuck hop in if he has anything he wants to add there. And then Chuck, after that, if you have any outside connections or other MLK stuff you want to recommend, you can dive straight into that as well.
Full stop. I 100% agree with Kris. I think foundationally, you have to read. I think I'll go a step further and say, like, for those that may not subscribe to Christianity or really embrace certain aspects of the Bible, I always tell folks to start with Matthew. It is by far the most clearest depiction of Christ, and also at the same time one of the best, if not the best, ways to understand what does it mean to be a Christian, from the stance of Martin Luther King and other things. I think I would challenge folks to really unpack Dr. King's work by measuring his impact that you can see across the country. In Boston, you have an incredible exhibit led by the Martin Luther King Foundation, I think, based there in Boston. They're incredible. And then if you get the chance, I had the chance to do this 2 or 3 times in my life, but if you ever get a chance to go down to Atlanta, Georgia, and see the home where he raised his family in, that at the time was like a moderate $85,000 max, like old school Atlanta. And it's like worth like a couple $100,000 a day. It just lets you know that he didn't do this to be rich.
Yeah.
Transparently. He did this because him and Coretta essentially wanted to make way for others. And then I got 2 shameless plugs that I've
Please.
very much appreciated. So I've been reading this book, man, that has been revolutionary. And it's called The Man at the Moment Demands. And it's by a guy by the name of Jason Wilson. And he talks about this notion of what does it mean to be a comprehensive man. And when you talked about Martin Luther King and his influence, I think Martin Luther King's leadership showed that he was a comprehensive man, but the ability to vacillate or to tessellate between being a leader, a father, a son, a husband, and the different responsibilities of such is also really good. And then the last one is this past Saturday, I had the chance to go and see someone who I consider to be a visionary, akin to a 2025 version of someone who's very inspiring that would hang out with Martin Luther King. Dr. Brandon Frame and the Black Man Can celebrated 15 years of making transformational impact for young and old Black men. And I'd be remiss to not give Dr. King's Morehouse brother a nod. So if you get a chance, go and check him out.
Nice.
And yeah, yo, like this was incredible to me. Randy, you're cool.
Chuck, you're so awesome, man. I'm gonna gush in a minute after I share my final connection, but like the intelligence you brought, the experience you brought to the conversation has just elevated this beyond what it could have been for just me and Kris. So thank you. I just wanted to land the media lit plane by I've got to briefly shout out Henry David Thoreau on the duty of civil disobedience.
There he is, English teacher.
Listen, I'm an English teacher. My education focused on that white male literary canon. I love me some American romanticism. I'm more of a Ralph Waldo Emerson than a Thoreau guy. At the same time, I'm also a Thoreau defender. People love to make him an easy punching bag. But it's like, guys, if you read Walden, like he acknowledges that like he's not cut himself off from society. It's not like a big secret that he's like going into town. But I'm not here to talk about Walden. I'm here to talk about On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. What I love about that when I'm reading Letter from Birmingham Jail is On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. Like it's cool. It's kind of fun. It's interesting. It's not coming from this place of like selflessness and love and brotherhood that Letter from Birmingham Jail is coming from. It's fairly self-indulgent. But Henry David Thoreau reaches a similar conclusion during his one night in jail because he refused to pay his highway tax because he didn't think it was worth it. And that's interesting. But having spent a lot of time studying that and then going back as a more educated person to reread Letter from Birmingham Jail and realizing how much more brilliant it was than anything Henry David Thoreau was able to say about civil disobedience was just a really cool experience. And my last MLK thing is just if you're out there and you've never listened to MLK's final speech before his assassination, I've been to the mountaintop. Um, it's incredibly moving from start to finish. Just from him acknowledging his constant awareness that his life is in danger, acknowledging that he doesn't regret any of his choices, suggesting that if God gave him a chance to live in any moment in all of time, he'd consider all these moments, but he'd pick the one he was in. To know these are the words of a man the night before he is assassinated is wild. And to English teacher you again, perhaps the best example of anaphora from MLK is, I have a dream, the repetition of I have a dream. I have a dream. But my favorite anaphora from MLK comes from the conclusion of that speech. The if I had sneezed section, where MLK is referring back to the attempt on his life where he was stabbed. The knife nearly strikes his aorta. It just misses. And there's a quote from the doctors in the newspaper, like if he had sneezed, that might have been enough to rupture his aorta, and he was not going to walk away from this. And he shares this story about getting all these letters from people of support, including the president and the vice president. But the one he remembers is from this little girl who said, I heard about what happened to you. I heard what the doctor said. I just wanted to tell you, I'm so glad that you didn't sneeze because you are still here. And he just repeats that. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't be doing this, that, and the other thing. If I had sneezed, and it sounds out of context, like a silly phrase, but with that incredible oratory, it's incredibly moving. People have pulled out just like that last little 5-minute conclusion from the speech. Even if you just check that out, it's I'm getting chills literally just kind of talking about it right now. And I was a little too hot in this room when I sat down to podcast, but yeah, that completes my MLK soapbox moment. So yeah,
such a powerful order.
All right, folks. So that brings us to the end of this conversation. This is one of the most important media lits we've ever done. This is an incredibly serious topic. There is nothing to really joke about or be silly about in this one. We love to bring you heart. We love to bring you humor, but sometimes we just want to feel something and look at those documents that reshape us, that shake and form our world. And once again, Kris has come for this conversation and introduced me to one of his friends who has now enriched my life. And whether you like it or not, Chuck, I'm going to be calling you my friend Chuck moving forward from this moment. So thank you so much for being here and enriching this conversation, man. I'm so thankful to you for being here.
Man, I'm grateful to be here. Randy, happy to call you friend and brother. Someday, Kris, I'm grateful to know you only as brother.
Nice.
And I just think that like when you look at like how to build across lines of adversity, like this is what he meant. This is what King meant when guys like figure it out. There's obviously things that we're doing more of. There's things that we can be doing less of. But I have a heart of gratitude and a mind of hope based off of conversations like this and actions like ours. Like, what did King say? Darkness can't drive out darkness. Only light can do that. A lot of light has been shed on this call. So thanks, fellas.
Man, Brother Chuck, so grateful to have you here with us. I always feel fired up after time spent with you. It's late at night right now, but I cannot wait for the sun to come up. I'm going to have a great day tomorrow. Thank you. Well, folks, hope you enjoyed the pod. We would love to continue the conversation with you in any format you might choose. If you enjoyed the conversation and you want to find more Media Lit, we are on all of the socials. You can find us on Instagram at media.lit.pod, on Blue Sky at media-lit. You can also still find us on the Twitter machine at media-lit-pod. And newly, we've introduced the YouTube. You can find us on YouTube at Media Lit Podcast.
Yeah. Kris, thank you so much for sharing our ever-growing list of social media. And yeah, when in doubt, click on our website down there. And I've got links to everything up there. I want you to find us wherever it's going to be easiest for you to grab our content. We want your emails, but hey, if it's easier to hit us up on social media, we love that too. Kris.
And don't forget to like and subscribe. You don't want to miss anything. We do a lot. And you gotta stay on top of it. Subscribe to the pod. And if you can give us a 5-star rating, we would be thrilled. No obligations, but we'd be thrilled.
Yeah, and if it's not a 5-star, I mean, I don't know if there's another podcast out there where 2 weeks ago I opened doing my impersonation of a wrestling announcer, and now I am here solemnly talking about how moved I am by Martin Luther King. But Kris, you've done us a great service. But what else do you have going on in the world that you want people to check out?
Yeah, I'm also an actor and a voice actor. I'm a father and a husband. You can find me doing all of those things on Instagram. I'm at Kris_Ingersoll. That's Kris spelled like Kringle. And I'm also the co-host of the Batman by the Numbers podcast on the Pop Break feed. We are having a fantastic year over there. It is our world's finest era. It's the year of Superman. We just dropped an Allies draft last month, which Randy was a fantastic contributor on, as always. So go check us out on the Pop Break feed, Batman by the Numbers.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kris. While you were talking, I actually was just hopping on to try to remember what my Instagram screen name is, which is R-Elaine. And you can find me over there. Honestly, I'm mostly just posting about Media Lit, but if you want to laugh, you can see the occasional family photo with the new bunny that my wife and boys forced me to get. So if you want to see me living bunny life, you can find that over there. But in terms of media culture, find me writing over on the Pop Break. I've been writing up a storm lately. I did week-to-week coverage of Severance Season 2. I'm in the midst of week-to-week coverage of the latest season of Doctor Who on Disney+. I'm tag teaming in with Bill Bodkin to help provide some coverage of Andor Season 2. So yeah, like life is busy, but there is so much great television out there. And last but certainly not least, please find me on my first ever podcast at the Pop Break podcast feed, Pod of Doom, a Black Sabbath appreciation podcast with Justin and Kris Mancini. Our next episode will feature one Kris Ingersoll helping us usher in the Dio era of Black Sabbath. So cannot wait to share that with you, bud. And hey, we've done it. Thanks for being here. Have a great night.